Uh, the goal of today is I want to help shape what we think about when we think about ministering to mental health. Uh, and I want to give you some things to help shape and there might be some things that are like a little outside the box. Like there's this interview that I really, really love between Anderson Cooper and Stephen Colbert, where they end up in this interview talking about suffering, which is so interesting because like Stephen Colbert is really open about the tragedy that he suffered very young in life. When he was a child, his father and brothers all died in a plane crash. And 2 months before this interview that you're about to see a clip from, Anderson Cooper, his mother passed away. And Anderson Cooper was incredibly close to his mother. And so, like, when the topic of suffering comes up, it's really interesting to watch because you have these two people standing at two different distances from their own suffering. For one of them, it is so much further in the distance, while the other one, it is much closer to them. And I'm going to show you two clips from it. I really love just the way this interaction goes. And I think it's just a good way to start. So here's the first part.
You told an interviewer that you have learned to, in your words, love the thing that I most wish had not happened.
I remember.
You went on to say, what punishments of God are not gifts? Do you really believe that?
Okay, I love the way that this begins because you can tell like Anderson Cooper gets choked up as he asks. Like you can tell he genuinely is interested in the answer. This isn't just for the interview or for the cameras. This is for him. And I also love just like little human moments that like as he gets choked up, Colbert tries to like step in and help out. Like, hey, you don't have to finish if it's too hard for you to finish. Like I can start answering. But then the way that like Anderson is like almost like determined, like, no, I'm going to get this out. And you can tell why, because like when he's asked the question, it sounds almost accusatory. That like for Anderson Cooper, where he's at, and from his perspective, it seems almost impossible to see how someone could view their own suffering this way. And he asks this question, and I want to play Colbert's response. It's a little bit longer, but I think it's worth it. But like I love one of my favorite things about it is the pause. When I think about ministering to mental health, there's all sorts of things that like have affected my imagination and the way that I think about how I want to act and what I want to do when when I find myself in these positions. And when I see this clip, I want to be like Colbert. So here it is.
Do you really believe that?
Yes. It's a gift to exist. It's a gift to exist. And with existence comes suffering. There's no escaping that. It's about the fullness of your humanity. What's the point of being here and being human if you can't be the most human you can be? I'm not saying best, because you're going to be a bad person and a most human. I want to be the most human I can be.
She would always say, why not me? Why would me be exempt from what has befallen?
And in my tradition, that's the great gift of the sacrifice of Christ, is that God does it too. That you're really not alone. God does it too.
Okay, that's that ending is so beautiful to me. That like after all of that to get to like the most beautiful thing about Christ's sacrifice is that like God does it too. That God comes and lives the most human life. Like, oh, I love that language that he uses. What is the point in being here and being human if you can't be the most human you can be? What if that was like an aspect of discipleship for us? Helping people learn how to be the most human they can be, creating an environment where they feel safe and brave enough to allow themselves to be the most human, which will involve suffering. That doesn't mean like help people to suffer, because like Colbert says, like everybody suffers, everybody is suffering, but there are a lot of ways that we can numb ourselves, that we can deny and distract and ignore it. And all of those things keep us from being the most human. And if being a human involves suffering, suffering is going to involve mental suffering. So we talk about like a lot of the time our heart, our mind, and our body as if they are completely separate from each other. But really, the more you learn about it, they are very, very connected. When you suffer physically, it affects your mind. And when you suffer mentally, it can affect your body also. I think that part of what I want to do today is like expand our imagination and expand the scope of what we picture when we think of ministering to mental health. Because, like, a pet peeve frustration for me is that sometimes it feels like ministering to mental health just means mentioning depression and anxiety from the stage, as if like that is the full extent of what it is. But like there is so much more to mental health than that. There's grief and stress and loneliness and trauma and addictions. And there are other diagnoses. There's eating disorders. There's OCD. There's bipolar. There's schizophrenia. And this wide range is all around us in this world. It's so much more than this little picture that we have in our minds. Like, okay, there's Alan Noble wrote this great essay called On Getting Out of Bed, The Burden and Gift of Living. And it opens with this author's note that I feel like really, like, I don't know, he's trying to do the same thing of like broadening the scope. And I love the language that he uses. Here's what he says. The subject of this book is mental suffering, and its assumption is that everyone experiences mental suffering at one point or another. This includes diagnosed mental illnesses and disorders, and undiagnosed or even undiagnosable anxieties, depressions, and burdens of life. It includes illnesses that have clear biological causes and ones that don't have any clear cause at all. It includes the suffering of those who would say that they have a serious problem, and those who would vehemently deny that they have a problem at all. It includes examples from specific mental disorders and general experiences of mental distress. Life is difficult, and we experience that difficulty in different ways and to varying extents, but we always experience it in our hearts and minds. And so when we're talking about ministering to mental health, wider, and not just those who are dealing with it, not just those who are dealing with their own diagnosis, their own loneliness, their own addiction, but ministering to those who are caring for those who are dealing with that. That is just like that. These things do not just affect us, they affect the whole community. And so I think, I don't know, it's just a much bigger thing. And so where do we start? Where'd be a great place for us to start? And I want to give like just like the simplest step for us as we grow in this. I like the idea is like investing in your perspective. How do you see things? What words do you use? What's your point of view? And how can we invest in our perspective? I think we can collect stories. That's just like a great, simple first step for all of us, from our family, friends, our church, our community. Stories that deal with mental suffering, stories that deal with depression, anxiety, stories that deal with a diagnosis you've never experienced in your own personal life before. Stories all, and like the thing is, like, these stories are there. And we just have to like grow curious and pay attention, and maybe sometimes ask a couple of follow-up questions. But like, it is so good for us to hear the words that someone uses to try to understand and explain their experience. Like, what happened? How did it feel? What helped? What made it worse? What all was affected? How long did it last? And stories give us insight to all of that. And not just stories from like your community, like listen to interviews, podcasts, reading memoirs, going out and seeking documentaries, just like looking for stories, because these stories give us words and words help us see. That's like Madeline L'Engle is a Christian author, and she says, we think because we have words, not the other way around. The more words we have, the better we are able to think conceptually. And so, I mean, like, there have been, for me, like, as I've been thinking about preparing for this, what are some of the stories that have like changed the way that I think about talking about these things? A couple of them are, I remember a long time ago, the first sermon series that Rick Warren did after his son's suicide. And I remember being so like, I remember walking around my neighborhood, and it was like an hour and 45-minute sermon, because it was like his first time back, and he told a lot of stories, and he talked a lot about suffering, and it was so helpful. But like, there was one thing in particular that has like always stuck out to me from his story. He said in that sermon, Don't say to somebody who just went through a major loss, they just got fired, they just got a bad report from the doctor. Don't say, call me if you need anything. That's about the dumbest thing you can say to somebody in shock, because now you put it on them. They've got to work to get your help. You're not taking the initiative. You're forcing them to take the initiative. And he goes on to talk about how, like, you can give people options, like call them up and say, hey, I'd love to bring you dinner. Does Tuesday or Friday work for you? Or, hey, I'd love to do this or this. Which one would be better? You know, giving a couple of options, but like, and that's something that he can say because of his story. That's something that he sees because of what he's experienced. And man, also, like, yeah, just the words that we use. Another one, memoir called Smile. Sarah Rule writes about giving birth to twins and shortly after being diagnosed with Bell's palsy and losing the ability to move half of her face, and just like how long that lasted and how frustrating it was. And like hearing her use words to talk about what did it feel like, how disconnected did she feel from everybody else, what were the things that gave her relief, what were the things that really frustrated her. And one of the ones that stood out to me is that she got so caught up on when people would say, I can't even imagine. She would be talking about what she's going through and her struggles, and they would just say, I can't even imagine. I can't imagine. I can't even imagine. And in the book, she just writes about how frustrating that phrase was to her. And she just got to this breaking point where she was like, well, can you try? Have you tried? Can you try to imagine it? But you're just keeping yourself so distant from it and say, like, oh, I don't even want to even begin to try to imagine what you're going through. Like, can you at least try? And it was just so, like, I don't know, it's a little thing, and maybe something that everybody, like, not every single person is going to find that frustrating, but like getting that insight from her, I don't know, helped shape my perspective. Another one is a documentary. Eugene Merman is a comedian. He plays Gene on Bob's Burgers, and this documentary follows him and his wife as his wife battles and eventually passes away from cancer. And in it, he tells the story of shortly after the diagnosis, as she begins treatment, friends and family, everybody's coming over and hanging out. Everybody's, trying to be together and spend time together. But normally when that would happen, everyone would talk to her and hang out, and then they would go in the other room to talk about her cancer. Or they would, follow the husband into the kitchen and ask a few questions with her outside of the room. And eventually, when she was alone with her husband, she said to him, nobody wants to talk to me about it. And it was just so, I don't know, an insightful moment of the loneliness that she was feeling. Everybody thinks that they need to walk on eggshells, but it's just causing her to feel lonelier and lonelier. And I love this line that Eugene Merman says in response to it. Talking about it isn't going to be the thing that kills her. Like that's the beautiful thing that stories give us. Stories give us these words, and these words that help us see. And these words come at the end of learning and growing and figuring out, what did I go through? What just happened? And like trying to make sense of it all. And then you have these words that help. And these words help you, and they can help other people. Because, like, man, that quote still sticks with me to this day. You grow curious, you pay attention, these stories are all around you, and we get more and more stories. That's important. Don't just stop at one. It's not like if you get one story of somebody's experience with depression, now you are suddenly an expert. But there are so many different ways it manifests and looks. Sometimes this triggers it, or that triggers it, or it looks this way or that way. Grief, addiction, shame, anxiety, all of these things look different at different times. And the more stories we get, the more we have a clearer perspective that it doesn't just look like one thing. And maybe it can also help us to defeat some bad ideas of what things are like. Like Alan Noble, who I read his author's note from his book earlier, he wrote on another website about his experience being diagnosed with OCD. And this is what he says in it. OCD is surprisingly prevalent in general population. Around 1 in every 100 people has it. In spite of this, and in spite of how disabling the condition can be, the condition is widely, sometimes frustratingly misunderstood. Typically, when people hear the term OCD, they imagine obsessively tidy people. It's not uncommon to hear someone refer to themselves as a little OCD about tidying their desk. The better informed, when asked about OCD, may think of someone who compulsively washes their hands. But the reality of OCD, especially in its severe and extreme forms, is much more debilitating. See, we get these stories and they help us. They help us with the words that we use. They help us get rid of a lot of frivolous words because stories bring these things so much closer to home, so much closer to where we are. And it will save us from, just like he talks about, because that is a thing, just like, I'm a little OCD, or, the weather is so bipolar here. Or like, okay, this isn't like completely mental health related, but like, what do you call this type of shirt? Hey, what do you call this type of shirt? Isn't that crazy? Isn't that what, like, I think about that still to this day, that like I grew up and just like this was called a wife beater. And like I wouldn't even comprehend what those individual words are actually saying. I just like, it's a windbreaker. Like the same way that you like, what is a windbreaker? Like what, it breaks wind? It's just like words that describe this. And the same thing, it's just like these are just words that describe this shirt. But like when you stop to think like, oh, wait, what am I saying? I'm being like frivolous with something that's pretty heavy. And the more we get stories about all sorts of things. Hey, I don't make frivolous jokes about suicide. I know a lot of people who do. And I bet those people have never struggled themselves or lost someone to it. Stories can help. So we get stories from other people. We're collecting stories. We're getting more and more stories, a great variety of stories. We're reflecting on our own stories also. Journaling. What was a really dark time? What was a heavy time in your life? What was a time that you didn't know that you can make it through? And finding the words, what did it feel like? What were your fears? What helped? What didn't help? And the more you start to work out your own stories and see them, that can be also incredibly helpful. And also living more stories. Like go out and live more stories. I think every pastor should at least once experience what it's like to go to counseling. Like you not go like just one session because that probably wouldn't be worth it, but like to go through the whole I mean, like I think that this is slightly unrelated. I think every pastor should at once a year experience what it's like to be a first-time guest at a church again. And just like go through the whole process of going to a church website and having to find the service times and navigating a church parking lot and finding the entrance and experience what it's like when people aren't friendly at all or when people are way too friendly or what it's like when you're like everybody knows each other and you don't. And like, it's good to be reminded of what that experience is like, because I think that can help you. And I think the same is true with like going to counseling. I think that it would be good. I think everyone should try it of going through the process of like going online and finding someone and picking a counselor. That can be a strange experience, and filling out all the forms and the awkwardness of that first visit. I think that would be really great because these stories, what I keep saying is like, they help us with nuance. They help us with nuance. We get stories from other people and we see, oh, wait, there isn't just like one way that this looks. There's not one way that grief looks. There's not a set timeline. There's not like it has this, and that. It adds nuance. And the same, like I see that with me. Because like I know that when I first started, the way that I would talk about counseling and medication was like, this is the greatest fix that will fix everything immediately. You have to do it right now. And like I know that I was like setting other people up for like too high of expectations, because I know that I did it for me. Because like for the longest time I would talk about like, hey, it's okay to go to counseling. You should go to counseling. You should go to counseling. And I had never spent a long period of time going to see a counselor before. And so finally when I did, I had the same expectations that I had been putting on other people. And my first counselor was the most disappointing experience. Like I had no idea that it could be a disappointment. I just thought like every counselor is the same. I know what to expect. I know it's going to happen and it's going to be exactly what I need. And this is going to be great. And I went into this guy's session and this dude talked the whole time. He did not let me speak. And when he did let me speak, it felt like he didn't listen to me. And he would go off on a tangent about something that had nothing to do with me. And I went to this guy twice and I just left so frustrated because I had like in my mind, I'm like, no, this is supposed to be perfect. This is supposed to be exactly what I needed it to be. And I needed to call a friend who works in counseling and talk to her about it and have her say like, no, yeah, that doesn't sound good. You should find another counselor. It's okay. There's somebody else who will be better for you. And then I needed like a couple of months. Like that was, I don't know, that disappointment like really hurt. So it took me like 2 or 3 months before I worked up the courage to try again. And the same is true with medication. Man, I feel like I just kind of talk in this kind of black and white way when like there's like nuance. Like counselors can be disappointing. And that's important to remember. That doesn't mean we like just like forget about counseling altogether. And like medications, sometimes you get put on the wrong medication and the side effects are so frustrating that like it's discouraging. Like that can be true also. And the more that we get stories, the more that we see, nuance. That's so important. I want to see. Josh says, it strikes me when you were talking about the comedian whose wife was dying, that we talk about having sin being exposed to the light as a way to find freedom, confession. It seems to me, it seems to me that the comedian is telling us that we can talk about things that aren't sin in the light as well. Yes, absolutely. All of the things that make us feel like we are a mess or we do not have it all together. It doesn't have to be sin, but like, even when it's like, I don't know how to talk to this person about this thing. And like, that can feel so like, I don't know, binding, restricting. Like that's it. Like fear condenses us and love expands us. And yeah, no, I think that is a great point. So anyway, like finding stories, getting stories, more stories. I made a resource for you guys. I'm going to send it out to everybody's email later today with just a couple of resources to help like give you some stories that deal with mental health and mental suffering. And I try to give like ones that are more fun and entertaining and like kind of goes from like fun to like the least fun, the heaviest. Because I know some people like this is like a whole new thing for them. And for some people, it can seem like daunting. Like, is this going to become my entire life? Like, shouldn't there be counselors and therapists? Like, I'm a pastor. Shouldn't I just focus on the thing that like a pastor should do? And like, yes, and absolutely 100%. And I think that this is a part of it. And I think like, what if you committed to just like once a month, consuming consuming something that deals with this to help you think about it better. And so I'm going to send this to everybody's email later today, but I do want to highlight a couple of them. And like I said, like these are sometimes funner. Like this is a documentary called Finders Keepers about just the wildest true story. This story is wild. And every person in it feels like a cartoon character. And at first you start laughing because it feels like everyone is so silly and what they're doing is so silly. But the longer you watch, the more you realize that like, oh, every person has a story. And every person has a reason why they care about the things they care about, why they're afraid of the things that they're afraid of, why they do the things they do, why they are the way that they are. And this movie starts off just like, hey, look at these funny, silly people. And the more you learn, the more you learn. I just think like that is a great experience to have, to remind yourself of that. Is it specifically about mental health? But no, but this helps us to minister to mental health better. Another one, Gary Gulman is another comedian. He has a stand-up special on HBO called The Great Depression, which is all about depression, an entire hour about depression. Very funny comedian. There are documentary clips about him and his mom and how she has helped him through his depression. And I don't know, another great story, give you perspective. The Small Bow, I talk about this all the time. It's a Substack about recovery. All sorts of people are writing anonymously about their experiences with addiction of all kinds. And it's just some of the most honest, kind, thoughtful storytelling that you can read. And people talking about some of their biggest mistakes and owning it and talking about when they feel like a mess and owning that. And like, I don't know, there's a way that they talk about it that I absolutely love. And these are all stories. And then also in the resource, there's mental health first aid. This is not stories, This is a training. They happen all over the country. And this is just like a really great resource if you're a leader in a community, right? Like this is for, yeah, leaders in a community, not for counselors or therapists, not for social workers. Like this is for if you just you're a community leader, and how to spot things, how to talk to people who are maybe having a moment where they are breaking from reality, how to, I don't know, what to say, what not to say, what your role is, what your role isn't. I took this a couple of years ago and I realized I've forgotten most of it. But I remember it being really good, but I feel like it's something that I should have done more often. Like maybe it's something I should do like every couple of years. But like as you begin to collect stories, and these stories start to shape the way that you think, the way that you talk, the way that you act, they start to shape your imagination. Like, man, that clip of Colbert is stuck in my mind. And there are times where I'm sitting across from somebody and they ask me a question and I'm like, I want to take this seriously the way that Colbert did. And the more you get stories, the more you get stories, the more you get stories, then you're going to turn around and you're going to share those stories. You're going to give everybody in your church the same experience that you just had of learning and growing and expanding your imagination by all of these stories. Share stories with your church for 3 reasons. 1, stories name. Another quote from Madeleine L'Engle says, "It's no coincidence that Jesus taught almost entirely by telling stories, simple stories dealing with the stuff of life familiar to the Jews of his day." Another typo. Stories are able to help us become more whole, to become named. And naming is one of the impulses behind all art, to give a name to the cosmos we see despite all the chaos. The first time I talked to my mom about my own depression, I was so terrified. And I called her up because somebody else had been talking to me about their experience and making me realize, like hearing somebody else's story made me realize like, oh wait, I think I might be suffering from this. And feeling like the first time that I should talk to my mom about it, and calling her up and finally taking that leap of faith and telling her. And the way that she responded, she said, "Oh, I've had that." She told me about how the postpartum depression that she had after I was born, and she had gone through a divorce, married my dad, and this is a new marriage. They're a year in, just have this new baby, and she was laying in bed thinking very clearly about the simplest way to take her own life. And not just take her own life, but like, what if we just took everybody's life? What if everybody in the family died together? That way. And she talked about how like she had that thought and just feeling like, I don't think I can tell my husband this. He's gonna think that I'm crazy. Like he just married me, and now he's gonna find out this and like keeping it to herself and locking it up and not telling him until much later, and him saying like, oh my gosh, why didn't you tell me earlier? Now her experience is totally different from mine. I have never been married or pregnant or divorced or had kids. I've never had any of those things. But she tells that story and she named that feeling of shame. She named that feeling of like, I can't tell anyone this. I can't talk to anyone about that. I feel crazy. They're going to change their mind about me. And that keeps us locked in and that keeps us stuck. And hearing that story helped me. Yes, that you named it for me. That is what it feels like. Stories of abuse or grief, depression, burnout, loneliness. When these stories are shared, sometimes people recognize their own experience. Maybe they've been in denial that it's been happening, but they hear someone talk about it and they're like, wait a second, that's me. Or you share a story and you name ways to freedom. You name hope that people have not been able to see for themselves. Stories can name, and that can be so helpful. The other thing, stories. Oh no, what? I did the wrong thing at that time, and I handled it well. Stories name. 2, telling stories. Oh no, wait, that was right. Telling stories show that it's okay to tell stories. So many people are suffering in silence because they don't think that they are allowed to tell their stories. If you're in a context where you don't feel like it would be well received to bring up mental health, maybe it's a more conservative church, maybe I don't know what the situation might be. if you're in a situation where you feel like talking about depression or anxiety, using the phrase mental health, that everyone would be closed off to that. What about teaching on shame? Talking about shame. It's Adam and Eve hiding from God. It's my mom laying in bed saying, I don't think I can tell anybody this. If you can talk about if you can just tell stories that deal with shame, times that you felt like a mess, but somebody loved you anyways, the ridiculous things that shame makes us do, and then preaching on like, what does Christ do with our shame? How do we defeat our shame? What is shame keeping us from? And if you start to talk about shame, if you start to share on shame, if people start to recognize shame, then topics about mental health are going to come up. And oftentimes, if it's a context where you don't feel like you can talk openly about mental health, it's because of shame. I cannot get this hair to do what I want it to. It's because of shame. It's because of shame. And so if you feel like mental health, we can't really talk about that, but we can talk about shame and show people that it's okay to tell stories. Somebody gets up and tells a story that other people are sitting in the audience with similar stories, and they have felt this whole time like, if I tell anybody about this, it's going to be like a black hole. And if I let this out, it's going to suck everything into it. It's going to ruin my life. But somebody else gets up and says, hey, this is what I went through. And the person in the audience sees that the world didn't end when they shared that story. That nobody just like got up and left. They saw like, wait a second, it's okay to tell this type of story. I mean, if somebody shares one type of story, other people will join in. Share stories about shame, other people will share stories about shame. If you share a story about pooping your pants, other people will start sharing stories about pooping their pants. If you share stories about feeling burnt out, other people will begin to share stories of that as well. And the stories that we share, again, if this is about shame, then what we're doing when we share our stories, we're trying to build a connection. The parts of the story that other people can recognize themselves in, those are the parts that like we feel. It's usually the details that we don't want to share in a story. A lot of times we want to like tell the craziest story with all of the craziest details and like just focus on like, no one's ever experienced anything as bad as me and this happened, and you're like really going at it with all of it. But like, if you want to share on shame, it's about the moments that kept you stuck, the moments when you were afraid, the things that you were afraid would happen, and then who helped you out of it. Sharing stories helps us to see that it's okay to share stories. And then also, stories show what's possible. It's not a guarantee. It's not like if you share a story like, all right, this is exactly what's going to happen for everyone. No. Like Colbert shows Anderson Cooper, here's what's possible, but like not what automatically is going to happen. Like, this is the perspective that I have now. This perspective is possible to have on the other side of your suffering. That does not mean it is a guarantee. You can share. Here's what's possible if you get help. Here's what's possible if you keep it to yourself. Here's what's possible when you lose someone you love. Here's what's possible when you start to get trapped in sin and shame. Here is what's possible. And with this point, I think, okay, like the algorithm in social media is trained to give you more of the same. And when we're getting stories, we shouldn't approach it like the algorithm. You watch one thing on Instagram and you watch the whole thing, then Instagram's like, all right, that's all we're going to give them now. We're getting more of this, more of this, more of this, more of this. Okay, here's the example that I have, and I think okay, it's probably the most controversial, but at least it could make you mad in either direction. Like if you had a family in your church, if you had parents in your church, and they had a teen son or daughter who came out to them as transgender, and then those parents went and only looked for stories of people who have transitioned and then detransitioned. Like if that's the only type of story that you consume, which like those stories exist and those stories are out there, but those are not the only stories about parents and kids who have come out as trans. And I think that it would be good for us to consume more than just one type of story. Because there are stories of parents who did not handle the initial conversation well, and the child has completely turned their back on the family. And maybe there are families that are praying and waiting for an opportunity to build that connection again, or families that are figuring it out and have no idea what they're doing, but they're just trying to make it from day to day. And then there are stories of families who are completely affirm and accept, and maybe they didn't at first, but now they do. And I think no matter what you agree or disagree with, it would be good to hear all of these stories. What words do they use? What did it feel like? What were they afraid of? What happened? Who helped? Who didn't help? How did the church respond? How did the people, what kind of dumb, frivolous things did people say when they were uncomfortable and they didn't know what to say? All of that would be good. All of that would be helpful. Man, this idea first, Wade Bearden is a friend of mine, and he wrote a book called Failing Faith about his father's battle with cancer and suffering through that. And in the book, he talked about how oftentimes in churches and in Pentecostal churches, you get testimonies of healing. Somebody gets up on stage and they say, I have this diagnosis and now I don't. And everyone cheers. And it feels like sometimes that's the only type of story that you get on stage. But that's not the only type of story. What about the story of somebody who gets up on stage and says, we prayed and we prayed for healing and they passed and it hurts and we're confused and there are some days that we do not want to get out of bed, but we keep coming to church and we keep praying and we keep hoping that this burden will lift. Now that's another type of story. It shows us what's possible. We get one type of story. We think like, well, that's it. That's all there is. But no. More and more stories, and sharing them in all sorts of places, sharing in sermons. As you start to take in resources, documentaries, and interviews, or you read a memoir, and there's like a line, like what I've shared stories from other people in this, or you share your own personal stories, your own experiences. In services, you have a testimony, somebody gets up and shares, or in small groups. You could create questions for your small groups that are intentionally designed to get stories out of people, or have like small group leaders prepare like one personal story for each small group. Just like, okay, with everything that you're talking about this week, here's like the plan for it. Do you have just like one good story that can help? Or even, man, I've heard of like small groups where they get together, they go to someone's house, they cook a big meal, and then somebody just gets up and tells their life story. I think that sounds amazing. That would be so cool. That'd be such a cool intergenerational thing to do, to get teenagers and older people, young people in all sorts of periods of life, and just like have people get up on what, like one a night, and they're just, here's my life story. Here's where I started. Here's where I met Christ. Here are big moments. Here are small moments. Here's everything. And they just share the whole story. I think that could be incredible, because like, that's the thing too. People in your church have so many more surprising stories than you realize. Even if you've been at the same church your entire life, there are still stories that will surprise you. And like, the more you get these stories, the easier it is to delight in the fact that somebody is trusting you enough to share this story. We can do it in sermons, in services, in small groups, and in one-on-one conversations, at lunch and at dinner. But okay, so this is how I'll close. Sometimes we can think that our role when it comes to ministering to mental health is like, we have to fix people, we have to take on other people's problems, it's up to us. But I love this quote from the therapist and author Lori Gottlieb. And she was asked in an interview how she handles taking on other people's pain in therapy. And she says, I don't think that I take on their pain. I think that what I do is I hold the hope for them that they can't see while they're in pain. I think that that is a very beautiful image and so helpful that maybe that is what we are doing as well. I'm not taking on, I'm not fixing, I will hold the hope for you that you can't see for yourself. At the end of the author's note at the beginning of On Getting Out of Bed, Alan Noble says this: if you take away one truth, the one thing in this book I know with certainty, let it be this: your life is a good gift from a loving God. Even when it doesn't feel good or like a gift, and even when you doubt that God is loving, please get out of bed anyway.